Okay, everyone, we'll get started in just a minute. I just want to make sure everybody can file into the Zoom room. Okay, everyone, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. I'm very excited to welcome you to this, our third presentation, our What Matters to Me and Why virtual series with Elena Naumova on telling the truth with data. My name is Marianne Hunt, and I'm the Director of Lifelong Learning and Travel in the Office of Alumni Engagement. What Matters to Me and Why is a series of virtual presentations followed by discussion that goes beyond the great research we've all heard about in an effort to give our community a chance to get to know how our faculty came to their topics and in their own words, what inspires and is important to them. But before I introduce Professor Naumova, I'd like to quickly go over a few housekeeping items. You'll notice that your audio and video has been turned off to eliminate any distraction and disruption from background noise. We'll have an audience Q&A session after the presentation, and if you'd like to ask questions, and I encourage you to do so, please do so using the Q&A function in the lower right portion of your screen. You'll also notice that closed captioning is on. If you'd like to turn this feature off, click Live Transcripts at the bottom of your screen and click on Hide Subtitles. If you enjoy this presentation, and I'm sure you will, please check out the Tufts Alumni YouTube channel for recordings of our past faculty webinars and alumni presentations. My colleague Amy will post a link to that channel in the chat now. Thanks. Lastly, I'd like to call attention to our community values. Our goal is to create an environment where everyone feels welcome to ask questions and participate in respectful conversation. Amy is going to post those values now. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Elena Naumova. Elena Naumova is a professor of mathematics and chair of the Division of Nutrition Epidemiology and Data Science at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy. She earned her PhD in two fields, computer science and immunology, and completed postdoctoral training in artificial intelligence and expert systems at the Novosibirsk and Bauman State Technical Universities in Russia. She leads several large-scale projects, including training grants funded by the National Science Foundation to improve graduate education in data-rich disciplines. She co-authored over 200 peer-reviewed publications and has led international projects with epidemiologists, immunologists, and public health professionals in the UK, Japan, Canada, Russia, Ecuador, Indonesia, and Kenya. And she serves as editor-in-chief of the Journal of Public Health Policy. Very recently, the Boston chapter of the American Statistical Association named her the recipient of the 2022 Statistical Outreach and Literacy Award, and she is also a very highly regarded faculty host for our Travel Learn trips. Elena is passionate about making sense out of data, and we have all witnessed the challenges of understanding scientific data and the nuances of the word truth in the last couple of years. So I'm very excited to have her here with us today to talk about this topic, what it is and why it matters. Please give a warm virtual welcome to Professor Elena Naumova.
Well, thank you very much for such a wonderful introductions. I will move my slides, start to move the slides around, and you can see that it's also come to the introduction page. Only what I want to add that I'm very excited about teaching two classes on advanced data analysis and data visualization and effective communication. And I'm teaching those classes for almost 20 years, and I really, really enjoy to do so. That's basically the reason how that talk is formulated and what I really want to talk in these presentations as well. You know, first of all, yes, I love to talk about data, and I love data. To me, statistics, it's one of the disciplines where I can enjoy everything what I can do in life. It's a nature, it's a patterns, it's a beauty, it's uncertainty, it's diversity. And basically that these three quotes on the screen contain everything what I will talk today in this presentation. I believe that it's very hard to count what you cannot really, what cannot be counted. It's our feelings, it's our emotions, it's our memories. But without data, it's very hard to build generalizable knowledge. And currently, people think that it's extremely challenging to put together science and storytelling because of they might mean different things when you speak about truth. But in the same time, I believe we need to bridge this gap and develop ways and means to make storytelling in science very exciting and palatable, and at the same time support storytelling with really very powerful data overall. So I will tell you give you a few examples. They are all built on the publications we recently published, and they're all supported by in-depth research from various national and federal foundations. So first of all, I really want to think about how we can combine data in a very exciting and powerful way. And to me, data visualization is a tool to tell the stories. I see so much of the potentials to build data visualization techniques, methods, ways to engage learner and engage them in the most powerful and most profound way. Because if I think that a good visualization can not only tell the story, but they can ease an explanation. It can guide discovery. And I'm using this very small picture from encyclopedia of my son. And I start usually a class on data visualization with this graph. And I said, everything about the graphical design can be made interesting and exciting. The question is only our creativity and how we can build our creativity in the most powerful and meaningful way. So I also give a chance to students to observe data visualization in the public media, which is extremely powerful. And I would say that in a recent decade, the use of data active and interactive dashboards in a data set become extremely powerful tool. People learn and observe so much from visualization presented by different sources, and like one of my favorites would be Nat Silver's website, or I really would like to entertain idea of choosing really very interesting visualization from The Economist. So those type of media provide really very good source of information. And in fact, we were watching very very in detail and very attentively with the class how the use of a dashboard during elections happens. And one of the main purposes of these dashboards to create a data repository and share this data with possible users, compress data, especially a large volume of data in a very compact form, and supplement this information to allow storytelling. And I usually, asking students to pay attention how this interactive dashboard change over time. So if you will, see even these maps in 4 flashes, you can see a really drastic change, and depending on the time when the maps were updated. And this create really very powerful foundation for building dynamic maps, which I will tell more in my presentation as well. I also ask students to find really very interesting graphs in their mind, and then ask questions: what's wrong with this picture? What could be done better? And this is extremely useful exercise for us to think about when we digest information presented in a graphical form. So with this graph, I will give you a couple of seconds to observe, and I will tell you what my students pick up, in a sequence, how they see the challenges. Everyone will start with pointing out that maybe you need to pay attention to the title, because sometimes titles and the subtitles do not talk to each other. And a death and murders with firearms are not necessarily equivalent. Then I ask students to check, what is, their impressions in terms of use of color and organization. And quite often students will point it out that, maybe the red shade is associated with the blood, might graph make it misleading or emotionally charged. People also start to pay attention how the data is organized. And for example, use of inverse axis can create a false idea of a trend presented in a graph. And, even psychological and different type of a study on psychology and pointed out that we have a different reaction time and cognitive load, how the data can be presented and displayed. Finally, students will immediately pick up that if you will be watching on the outlines and emphasis of the graph, it might create again an impression that after the law was enacted, it was a drop in whatever trend is shown, but it's actually lead the reader to conclude some false causality in presenting this data. So any graph, if it's constructed in a certain way, could lead or create a path to false causality. And we need to be really very watchful in terms of how the graph is constructed, how it's presented. In fact, this graph was redrawn by one of the data enthusiasts. So you will be able to see that if the axes right now are presented in the right way, we will be able to see that after the law was enacted, it was increase in deaths followed by this process. So it means that every single graph we design, we need to be really very much minded about how the graph will be perceived. But since it's really very important and powerful tool, let's think about how we can use this tool for understanding large-scale outbreaks. To me, it's first of all a really very important recognition that it's a multifaceted crisis. It's a crisis of data collections and sharing. It's a crisis of communications and ethics. It's a crisis of concept and models, because of every time we are testing our understanding how data are collected, how they communicated, how they examined, and how they modeled. And in this very short talk, since the topic is actually not for even 20 minutes, it's endless topic, but I only focus on 3 most important lessons I personally learned from these projects. Data are not intuitive. It's hard to imagine that every single piece of information will be given to the audience or will be given to researchers, and you can immediately make the statement what it means. Data are messy. They require a tedious work to be arranged, to be created in a form and shape that you can actually make sense out of it. And sometimes oversimplifications is extremely harmful. So we need to be mindful about the complexity and learn how to present this complexity with the data in a most coherent and respectful way. So I will be talking about 3 papers. In all of this paper, the major contributions and major contributors are students from Tufts University, from all the different schools. I will be talking about flu pandemic and seasonal influenza as well. I will be talking about cholera during the civil war in Yemen, and I will give you a glimpse of data collected during the COVID pandemic and what we contributed to this study. So let me start with key elements, what we are watching, why it's a challenge, and what is really most important about large-scale outbreaks. We all the time need to think about how to define its starts, its spread, its containment, its resolution, and its overall toll associated with a large-scale outbreak. And every single question there about the start and spread and containment will actually need to be spelled out in a much more detailed questions: when and how and where it started, who was the index patient, where the causal pathogens, how it's discovered, and how the outbreaks are declared. And it's also really very important to understand how it's spread, how it's traveled across the population, and if any containment measures were effective overall. And when it's over, we will ask the questions: what is a general final tally, and what is implication, and what lessons we learn from each outbreak. So you can see that even the questions are quite generic. They are very much required really very careful data compilation and agreement of many parties to understand what we mean by this data and this notion. So let me start with influenza. We all really very well understand that it's a seasonal processes, and those seasonal processes sort of like we expected every single winter, that the flu will come sometimes earlier, sometimes later. Sometimes we don't know exactly where it hits the first. But in order to make those predictions more palatable, we need to collect data in a very detailed and very, very organized manners. So with this specific project, one of my biggest messages here is data are not intuitive, and it's our task to examine, arrange, find a way for effective and compelling and comprehensive data presentation. And what could be better than dynamic mapping? So in dynamic mapping, it's a tool which allowed us to see many patterns simultaneously. We are talking about quite large data volumes. So we are extracting data from over 300 million records of hospitalization of among adults over 65 in the United States. We extracted all the cases of influenza. We converted them into weekly rates, and we add information from almost 9,000 ground meteorological stations. So it's a huge volume, but we want to see how those patterns are created. So I will show you a series of movies which basically give a glimpse of how and where it starts, how it spreads, and how it's related also to a seasonal dynamics. And by season, in this specific case, I will be only talking about how the temperature and the cold waves are coming through north, spread in the country, and allowed you to see the relationship in the winter patterns. So let me play a movie. The dynamic. And I will start it a little bit earlier, so it will give us a little bit of a chance. So you can see that it's only beginning of November, and you can already start to see a cluster which starts in the south. And it's basically every single week how it starts to spread. And within a really very short period of time, it's covering pretty much all the area and start to dissipate really very quickly. And that's only one single outbreak. And if I will move it a little bit further, and we will move to another outbreak, so it's the next season, you can also start to see that in October, it's pretty quiet. It's a random cases here and there. It's not yet really creating a pattern on its own, but you start to see a more prominent, we call it percolating clusters. And those clusters again start to grow faster. It's again within a couple of weeks, the spread is pretty powerful, and it's spread throughout all entire country. And wait a little bit, and closer to March, it will start to dissipate. So this technique allowed us to see where it starts, how it starts to move around, do we see any traveling waves of influenza, and where it's actually can stop. So using this type of a technique, we can start to build more and more really very important messages. But data are extremely messy. They're challenging, and it's actually our task to increase the value of the data we collect, the usefulness, their usability. Data collections are never coming for free, and data spread and data dissemination are also never coming for free. So we need to think about how to be mindful and increase longevity and usefulness of this type of data and this type of information. This leads me to a second example, and that example is related to cholera spread during the civil war in Yemen. The main challenge working on this paper was basically understanding that during the war, all the advancements in public health, it's 100 years of effort in understanding how the cholera spread through the drinking water and different waterways, how it actually can be controlled by improving malnutrition, by improving nutrition in specific area, providing water treatment, supporting water treatment facility, and providing really very important treatment and vaccinations for those who either affected or could be affected in the area. And what we see in places torn by war and conflicts, it's basically every single barriers we were trying to build as a public health professions were destroyed. And due this type of actions, which we see as truly man-made disaster, we are able also to detect how the infections can be spread, and especially in area when it is challenging for us to detect in an obvious way. So in this movie, we started to build this type of dynamics as well. For a very long time, the country was free from cholera, or even some cases existed. It was sporadic. It may happen here and there, but it's not really in a systematic manner. And they can be treated in the proper time with the proper solutions and proper treatment available to population. But as soon the small cases start to create a small clusters, and on the top of these clusters, we will see how the infrastructure can be destroyed. The cholera can change their spread and their intensity very, very rapidly. So in this case, just watch very carefully that truly within 1 week, the whole entire country become a source of infections, and infections will spread almost immediately. And unfortunately, even till now, the outbreak is still there. It's not disappear. It means this area is extremely unsafe for travel. This area is very unsafe for providing the care, and it's extremely challenging to add in this specific area improvement to the infrastructure as well. So this dynamic map allowed us to see the changes. Color represent the intensity of the cholera rate, and we can see how it starts to change. And sometimes it's changing the cluster where it is, but you might also observe that there are some persistent clusters. It's locations where cholera is not planning to leave, it stay there in a very consistent and persistent ways. And it become really very challenging to create the measure to reduce this type of dynamics. But you might also ask questions, what if I want to see these two processes simultaneously with cholera and a conflict? So we know that the bombing, the destructions of the infrastructure, the changes in the water treatment facility, or bombing of water treatment facility, or blockade happens simultaneously. And it's also allowed us to see where the conflict happens and how fast or how immediate or how soon you will be able to see increase in cholera as well. So these dynamic maps, and I know it's hard to follow one map, it's even harder to follow two maps simultaneously. But this is actually an important tool for us to develop and to provide this type of tools for public health professionals, for humanitarian assistance, for people who are really very much driven by the missions of reducing the infections, building the peaceful negotiation, peaceful agreements, and providing humanitarian aid to affected population. So again, this tool is very powerful, but require a lot of work and data compilation. So it just only as another example to say the power of this dynamic type of mapping and power of building the story with extensive volume of data, I want to talk more about the COVID pandemic in the United States. And here, another really very important lessons, which I would like to highlight, it's a lessons related to need for thinking about that simplification is useful, but oversimplification could be really very harmful. And we need to think about how to present this very complex idea to broader audiences. This dynamic map show how how COVID spread in United States. And you probably remember that we hear, initially reports in different locations, but it start to take a speed very, very rapidly. And if you will think about a probability of cases to be observed in every single communities, here it's color represent how many cases per 100,000 population occurs in a week. We practically start to see that by summer of 2020, practically there is no communities which didn't have this type of experience. And even if you even see the white spots in the map, is a community which either refused to provide data or this data is very challenging. Now look for the drop. That drop was very essential for us to pick up. And it's allowed us to think about what truly happens in real time. This drop was associated with a loss of data or with poor reporting during the famous holidays effect between the Christmas and the New Year, where that information can be basically, I wouldn't say misleading, but it's not complete information. That incomplete information require us to be very vigilant about what data is available, what data need to be, curated properly, and how they need to be presented properly. But it's also a really very important message for us to think about how we can use the power of this data and power of data visualization to address issue related to COVID misinformation. The more data we have, the more misinformation we observe. And interestingly enough, that transmissibility, transmission, illness, mortality, the spread of infections come to the top of misinformation topics discussed in media and propelled through the media streams. So I believe that if we will use our data in a wise and coherent way, at least it's our small but maybe powerful contribution to combating the misinformation related to coronavirus infection. It's also make me think more about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and you will say, what a mathematician will do with that. And I think it's extremely important for us to also to rethink what the freedoms, what information, what we do in science, what we do in communication to help us to translate this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, especially these two articles, in what freedoms means to you. So as the editor of the journal, I'm putting my editorials on for each issue. And for one of them, I decided I want to express how I would reframe the freedom in the modern world of data and knowledge. And I believe that specifically forcing us to think through the COVID experience, that the personal freedom is an ability to keep our family members and our neighbors and our community out of the harm's way. And I believe that such ability should be guaranteed by society at large. So in conclusion, I try to convey you three most important lessons I learned through our research projects. That data are not intuitive. Sometimes you need to put really very substantial effort to put the data in the right patterns and in very comprehensive and compelling presentations. Data are very challenging. They may be messy. They may be poorly aligned, and it's really require skills and knowledge to put them that they will present story correctly. And given that we are living in a complex world and we are dealing with the complex problems, data need to be presented in maybe simplified, but not oversimplified ways. And it forces us to think about how to find the right models, the right methods, the right data, the right messages that we will feel comfortable and convinced by the story we're trying to tell. And in conclusions of my talk, I would like to thank my students who are really a powerful tool for building our communities. All these papers were written during the COVID, during the lockdown, and I am extremely thankful for their resilience. They were a fantastic partners on the road, and they were basically main drivers for the talk I am giving you today. And I'm thankful for the sources which support this grant, including Tufts DISC seed funding, which supported our COVID and flu research, and also federal funds as well. In this note, I will conclude my presentation, and I am open for any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Elena, for that thought-provoking presentation. We are open for questions now, so I'd like to remind folks that you can put them in the Q&A feature in the lower right-hand portion, but we already do have one very interesting question from Anna Kate. How do you approach the challenge of finding the boundary between helpful simplification and oversimplification?
Oh, that's a tough one. Thank you very much. It's a challenging question. I don't know. It's a try and error. Sometimes we think that it will go really very well in these directions. It's not, it's not really supporting. In fact, when we were working with data on cholera, I will tell you honestly, we've got one batch of data reported daily, another batch of data reported weekly, another batch of data reported monthly. And we need to make that very careful decision, what we will choose in terms of working with this data. On the one hand, we want to be as granular as possible, especially knowing that the bombing or blockade will happen in specific time period. On the other hand, we just need to think about, or maybe presenting data in a more core scheme would be simplifying. It will be much easier to give a message. In fact, a lot of reporting agencies using monthly data, not daily data. But you actually, by the fact that we were using daily records for COVID, allowed us immediately to see what was the effect of the day of the week. People tend to go for testing during the working days, not on the weekends. People tend to go for extra testing or additional testing when it's very close to travel. And it means there is unusual spikes in the data. And then you need to make a decision. Is it real? That's exactly what happens in a society? Or it is something just a data glitch, which required to be cleaned and curated and verified multiple times in order to make this judgment as well. Like, is this peak is truly real, or it's just a composite or something of some records which were not really compiled properly? So the short answer is it's a trial and error, and it's a constantly doubt. Have a doubt, do the iteration, and do due diligence in terms of understanding when it's simplified or oversimplified.
Interesting, thank you. That actually does lead into another really thoughtful question. I see it as kind of tangentially related to it. It said from Stephen, when you use reported data, how do you detect possible biases in the data set? The biases can be intentional or unintentional. And we have a lot of good AI people here at Tufts who have done some work on biases in these areas. So I'd love to hear how if you have any advice.
No, again, fantastic question, especially now. One of my editorials was specifically focusing on structural missingness. I don't believe in random missing values. They all happens for reasons. Quite often we just don't know those reasons. We're talking about collecting data about the cholera in Yemen. Immediately you know that you will get data only from population which is easier to reach. In hard to reach populations, this data will be missing. And it's a missing for a reason. Somebody cannot come to this location and collect that data or bring people to the hospital. So those type of biases exist, and we need to be really very open and very clearly define them. As the editor of the journal, I have a most stringent demand in terms of presenting limitations of this data. And I am asking to say, tell me limitations about and gaps in your data, gaps and challenges of your methods, gap and challenges of the study design. Because if sometimes we design the study and we did not really recognize that this data could be missing, or we design it to create a convenient sample, that's doomed to be biased. And I don't believe that it's possible to solve all the problems with bias by just only massaging data analytically. It's not truly happening this way. It's just necessary to think and rethink about the whole entire scientific approaches for observational studies. When we observe something, what does it mean? Which side of the story we see and which side of the story is presented to us. So it's a challenge. But it's again, we just need to be more open, presenting more clearly uncertainty associated with this data. Now, if I will show you the same type of a map, but I will be focused on uncertainty, you will see immediately, maybe the rate is high, but uncertainty even higher. So that it's again, it's a question about you cannot oversimplify the process, and it's better to give a more detailed and more convincing and more comprehensive picture.
It actually reminds me too, or brings in this idea of the liberal arts education in my mind, because I was listening to something about how can the average person weed through disinformation in social media. And really the specialist said, just question everything. Like we have to keep kind of questioning and thinking critically, and to what you're saying, like look at the source, what could be missing, because sometimes what's missing is also very telling. So it's such an interesting topic. We have more questions besides just mine. With regards to data for industry, how do you go about creating these unique visualizations to differentiate yours from any competitors, or for the standard industry data? Like how do you create these?
We start to work with data related to foodborne outbreaks. And that's a very sensitive topic. It's a very challenging to get the data from industry. It's all the time kept proprietary. You need to spend so much time in convincing people to share and have an open conversation about this data. The data which I demonstrated to you, most of them are coming from public sources. It means governmental decisions or intergovernmental decisions were made to make this data public. But it's extremely challenging to bring industry into the same realm. Twitter data had an agreement that was provided also for free for researchers to use. Sometimes some entities agree to share the data after signing some kind of agreements in terms of what could be shared, how it could be shared, and so on. And we need to be constantly vigilant about how we frame this type of agreements, what we agree to work on, and where we will feel uncomfortable because of it maybe create that type of a biases as well. I wish to see industry more open in terms of the sharing their resources, because I think that we all at the end will benefit from knowing what it is. And regulations which are put up front for data sharing are quite powerful. We see better shared data in Europe and in countries of European Union than in United States. And this maybe can change.
It's interesting because a really good colleague of mine just forwarded an article to a few of us about trust. And one of the key elements of trust is transparency. And so to your point, to be more forthcoming and more transparent about where the data is coming, about the data and the data collection, could possibly help to address some of the trust issues that I think we saw a lot of during the pandemic in particular. So interesting. We have another question from Stephen. Do you have specific methods to identify possible confounding variables? Which I think would mean like this, if you have a lot of variables, it just becomes even more complicated to tease out and then to get to the narrative that you want to get at.
Absolutely. So the maps which we design, they're not only just to amuse for amusement and just to see, oh, that's a color changing on the screen. For us, it's a tool. And we are using this type of maps for guiding, building and guiding principles for more detailed analysis. We know that when I show you the map of influenza for elderly in United States, we definitely need to be mindful that the rate of infections would be higher in locations with a higher proportion of elderly. We also see that increase and change in the rate of infections would be reflective of poverty, fragility of the population in a given location, access to facilities, because of, given the rural hospitals right now are in disarray, quite often people need to travel over 100 miles until you will reach a point with a specialized care. So yes, a couple of papers we published based on this type of principles, where they were initiated by specific questions, how we can address confounding, how we also can start to think about explaining what really happens. Is it, do we observe a direct effect or indirect effect? Is it effect mediated by some other characteristics? And maybe some factors are amplifying the signal and some of the factors are dampening the signal. And one of the paper we were working and published recently was very much related when the peak starts for influenza. If it starts right before kids will go and students will go on a vacation, you will see a dampening effect immediately because of its a social structure. It's how we congregate, how we spread infections. It's really truly matter. We also see unusual spikes in locations where, it's a football game, during the winter seasons. So all of that is real, and they're all contributing to changes in the pattern, but it's better for us to learn better how all the social and our political and our economical factors are influencing the dynamic. And this is really an important work which we need to continue.
Here's a question. Maybe just it's a little more subjective, and we'll get a little bit into your insight on this. Like, how do you pick the art? Because you're editor of so many journals. What is the criteria for include an interesting story to include, or what is an interesting paper? How do you determine what is a good story?
Well, during COVID, the journal experienced such a huge influx of submissions. We went from 300 submissions per year to almost 800 submissions per year. So that's clearly was an interest from a reader, what we want to read and what we see from a journal. It was also a very big influx from the submissions, a desire to share what people see, what they experience, what kind of recommendations can be offered. And we were very much attentive to understand how people really tell their stories, how compelling their stories, how solid the data. So we were given preferences to what really give an original view, an original pattern. Those who have a high quality of data collection schemes and data design. So some of the papers were very much picked up by media. And that's one of the factors that we really want to spread the message as well to a much broader audience. The journal is focusing on public health policy. So the conversation was all about, how legit to have this type of interventions, how much they infringe on our social and liberty and freedom. And that's an important point of discussions, which were not really touched before in such depth and details. And COVID uncovered so many societal problems. So we were very sensitive to be able to cover the broadest possible range of questions and to be on the forefront of what kind of messages which we need to really to address, to propel, and to hear, especially the communities which don't have much of a voice, and those communities where they are more voices can be muffled by noise and too
Mhm.
loud exclamations.
Well, thank you. Does anybody, I'm going to give people just another moment to put in questions if they have any lingering questions, but I just want to thank you. It's so interesting to hear your perspective, and it makes me think about, and I'm curious if you have any feelings about sort of the responsibility of scientists who are reporting out data, because when you're using the data and telling the stories, that affects public opinion, and public opinion affects policy as well. And so within the scientific community, is there a strong sense of duty around this? Are there organizations that support it? Movements or whatever?
Absolutely. And I believe that like for journalism, it's one of the criteria is a fact checking. But
Mhm.
for publication, it is not only its transparency, which is one of the really important principles, but we start to put more and more policies related to open data sharing. So if you said, I analyze this data, where that data sits, sometimes in the past it was sufficient enough to say, oh, if you will make a request to the authors, they will share with you the data, the methods, the thoughts. But sometimes it is extremely challenging to promise because of people maybe not working in the same institution. Maybe there is no institutional memories. How to ensure that the data presented in every single paper can be accessed later on, can be checked and rechecked when the new evidence will come. So we are very much thinking about how to create the culture of using open source and open
Mm.
share data repositories so
Yeah.
you can come back to this information because
Mm.
of whatever I was thinking about the modeling, the data analysis 20 years ago, there are huge progress in the area of data analytics. Many papers which are published 20 years ago, now I have tools to do it better, to do it in a faster, in greater details and with a higher resolution, better scale, higher precision, higher credibility. So it makes sense to once in a while to revisit what you learn, what you've done, and how you can do it better at the current moment. We also not only asking people for, better transparencies and higher level of credibility. We ourselves, when we published our work, we are submitting data into the public domain. So everyone can see the data, the codes, the analysis, how we created the graphics, and we are asking the broad scientific community, if you can do better, tell us, because of it's really speaks for a progress in this area. And of course, sometimes it's maybe a little bit of unrealistic to expect that everything will happen the way how you desire, but without trying, it's very hard to imagine something will move.
Great, great. We have a couple more questions, and I think we can let you go. But what part of the process from data collection to final presentation do you find the most difficult or challenging?
Data cleaning.
Data cleaning.
Absolutely.
Yeah, explain what that is a little bit.
So, I have a joke which I will tell to students all the time. If you think that every single data which you will get in your real life look like a textbook, you are very much mistaken, because of when you download data from different sources, like what you see in the first map, it was data records from the Center for Medicare Services, and it will come a dump of 300 million points. And you need to see every single one of them to check if the information about date is correct, information about the zip code is correct, if information about the disease is correct, and you go and it is on iterative mode constantly. Because of you might feel, oh, I'm done with the data verification and data cleaning. No, it's not. Because of some part of the analysis, you should come back again and uncover again that something need to be fixed and something need to be corrected. So even the records which you think that fully polished and fully organized still have really a very big challenges. And those challenges can be only uncovered during the data analysis. So we typically, our typical joke is that 70% of the time you will spend on data cleaning, verification, and preparation. Maybe 10% of your time you will do on modeling and designing. And maybe 10% when you will be really focusing on your graphical design. And the rest you will be like spend on polishing and polishing and polishing. Because the first draft never really the draft you want to share. And before you will see anything done in the polished way, there are many iterations which will happen. It's one of the main lessons right now for students. Don't think that it's just only like one click on a button.
Which is interesting because this is a really interesting question is, do you see changes in how your students choose and design before and like at the beginning of your course and then after your course?
Oh, I see a sea of change. And sometimes it's a frustrations because of you realize, oh my God, I thought I will spend 15 minutes and my homework will be done. We implemented a couple of innovations in the course itself. You know, it's funded by the National Science Foundations because of its focusing on how to improve the education. One of the very big and important component of this process is to learn to listen your peers. And it's tough. You know, it's a tough because of it's sort of like, you know, oh, it's my baby. I created this picture and you criticize my work. How it could happen and or why it's a peer criticizing my work, not the instructor. And I think it's actually asking us to very carefully think about if you're designing the graph for audience, your peers is your audience, and ability to provide feedback, to receive feedback, provide it in a constructive way and receive it without tears. Oh, that's a huge professional and personal growth. So in the class itself, you know, we start with, oh, find me a picture and give a critique of this picture. And everyone was absolutely fine to do this kind of a task. In the middle of the class, I asked, okay, you design a picture and let your peer to criticize it. And that was a little bit more tearful. But at the end of the class, I think that everyone can see, because we actually even designed the website, which allowed to see before and after effect. You know, students themselves amazed that like, oh my God, I didn't even know that I can do this type of work, but you can. It just require rounds of practice and iterations and improvement.
Wow, that's great. So I think we have time for just one more question that we have here, and then we'll say goodbye for now. Do you, because I think it's really important and sort of speaks to what I was saying earlier, is that do you work with journalists to serve journalists who serve general audiences and how to interpret complex data analysis?
Oh, not only I work with them, I teach with them. So my wonderful co-teacher in a class on data visualization, that part of effective communications, he's responsible. Corby Kamal, he is editor of The Atlantic, and he is absolutely fantastic teacher. We co-teach together for almost 5 years right now. And that co-teaching is really very important for us as well. You know, we are educating each other and we are learning from each other. It's how to present that information, how to find what is relevant to the audience, what speaks to their minds, how you start the story and how you build the story, and being truthful to your story. Do not stretch the data to fit the narrative, okay? And don't oversimplify the narrative because of the life is more complex.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's actually a nice positive note to end this on. And I want to thank you so much, Elena, for this inspiring session and giving us more things to think about. I'd like to thank all of our attendees for joining us. This is the last What Matters presentation for just this year, but please watch for more in winter, later in winter. And in the meantime, be well and hope you can join us for another program in the future. Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.